The Manhattan skyline glittered through the rain-streaked windows of the subway car as I clutched my weathered leather portfolio against my chest. My father's old suit, the navy one he'd worn to every important occasion until he passed, hung a bit loose on my shoulders now. I'd lost weight these past 6 months. Stress does that to you when you're choosing between paying rent and eating properly. I checked my phone, 9:47 a.m. 13 minutes until my interview at Apex Creative Studios, one of the most prestigious advertising agencies on the East Coast. This was it. My last shot. After 147 rejected applications, countless ghosted emails, and 3 rounds of interviews that led nowhere, I'd almost given up. But when Apex called, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was fate. The subway car jerked forward, and I steadied myself against the pole. Around me, Manhattan's morning commuters stared at their phones, lost in their own worlds. A woman in an impeccable Burberry coat stood next to me, and I caught her glancing at my suit, the slightly outdated cut, the fabric that had seen better days. Her eyes moved away quickly, dismissively. I'd become used to those looks over the past year. After my father died and the medical bills came due, I'd sold almost everything. My car went first, a 10-year-old Honda that got me $3,200. Then the furniture, most of my clothes, the few pieces of jewelry my grandmother had left me. I kept 3 things. My laptop because I couldn't work without it, my father's portfolio because it held 20 years of his creative legacy, and his navy suit because it was the last thing I had that still carried his scent, faint as it was. The suit had been expensive once. Brooks Brothers, purchased in 1998 when my father landed his first major client. He'd worn it to pitch meetings, gallery openings, my high school graduation. It had been part of his armor, his way of telling the world he belonged in rooms where decisions were made and creativity was valued. Now it was mine, altered to fit my slimmer frame, the lining replaced twice, the buttons changed out once. It was clean and pressed. I'd made sure of that, spending my last $20 at the dry cleaner 3 days ago. But clean and pressed couldn't hide the fact that it was decades out of style, couldn't conceal the tiny repair along the left shoulder seam, couldn't change the truth that I looked like someone playing dress-up in their father's closet. The subway lurched to a stop at 42nd Street. I stepped onto the platform, my worn dress shoes clicking against the wet pavement as I emerged onto the street. October rain misted down, turning the city into a blur of gray concrete and yellow taxis. I didn't have an umbrella, another casualty of financial triage. The Apex building towered above me, all glass and steel ambition, the kind of place that made you feel small before you even walked through the doors. I'd researched the firm obsessively over the past week. Founded by Catherine Ashford in 1995, it had grown from a boutique agency to an industry powerhouse. They'd created campaigns that had become part of popular culture, won every award worth winning, represented clients whose names were synonymous with luxury and innovation. And somehow, impossibly, they'd called me for an interview. I took a breath, tasting rain and exhaust fumes, and pushed through the revolving doors. Inside the lobby, everything screamed money. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, abstract art that probably cost more than my entire year's rent, and a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of rare wood. Behind it sat a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture. Her name tag read, Melissa. "I'm here for a 10 a.m. interview," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Creative director position." She barely glanced up from her computer, her manicured nails clicking across the keyboard with mechanical precision. "Name: Jordan Mitchell." More clicking. The pause. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to the screen. 23rd floor. "Someone will meet you at the elevator." "Thank you." I walked to the elevator bank, hyper-aware of how my shoes squeaked slightly against the marble, how the security guard at the desk tracked my movement with professional suspicion. I pressed the button and waited, watching my reflection in the polished elevator doors. The suit looked even more out of place here, against all this gleaming perfection. The elevator ride felt like ascending into another world. Each floor number that lit up was another layer of my anxiety. I counted my breaths, a trick my therapist had taught me during my father's illness, when panic attacks became a regular visitor. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 6. When the doors opened on 23, a woman in her mid-30s stood waiting. She was immaculate, tailored blazer in charcoal gray that probably cost $3,000, crisp white blouse, black pants that fell at exactly the right length above designer heels. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup subtle but flawless. She extended her hand, and I noticed her wedding ring, a diamond that caught the light like a small star. Jordan Mitchell? Her grip was firm but cold, the handshake of someone who did this 50 times a week. I'm Victoria Hastings, senior recruiter. Follow me. We walked through an open office space, and I tried not to gawk. It was like walking through the pages of a design magazine. Exposed brick walls painted pristine white, standing desks with multiple monitors, industrial lighting that somehow managed to feel warm. Young creatives hunched over their workstations, some sketching on tablets, others gesturing at screens during video calls. Everyone looked polished. Everyone looked like they belonged. I suddenly became hyper-aware of every flaw in my presentation. The frayed edge of my suit cuff that I'd tried to trim last night. The scuff on my left shoe that I'd covered with black marker, hoping it would pass. The fact that my briefcase was actually my father's old portfolio, held together with love and luck rather than expensive leather craftsmanship. How was your trip in? Victoria asked, the question automatic, her attention already on her phone. Fine. The subway was running on time. She glanced at me then, and I saw it, the flicker of assessment and dismissal. Of course I'd taken the subway. People who belonged in places like Apex took cars, Ubers, arrived without rain in their hair or anxiety in their eyes. We're very excited to meet you, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Your resume showed some interesting experience. Interesting. Not impressive. Not exciting. Interesting, the word people used when they couldn't think of anything genuinely positive to say. We arrived at a glass-walled conference room. Through the transparent walls, I could see 2 other people already seated at the long table. Victoria opened the door, and I followed her in. This is Preston Burke, our Chief Creative Officer. Victoria gestured to the man sitting at the head of the table. He was in his 50s, with carefully styled silver hair and an expensive watch that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 3 months. His suit was European cut, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that announced wealth before words were even spoken. And this is Vanessa Liu, Executive Creative Director, Victoria continued, nodding to the younger woman seated to Preston's right. Vanessa had sharp, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses, her hair cut in a precise bob that somehow looked both professional and edgy. She wore all black, turtleneck, pants, ankle boots, like a creative director from Central Casting. I shook their hands, noting how Preston's eyes traveled from my face down to my suit and back up again, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. It was subtle, but I'd seen that look before, the internal calculation of worth based on external presentation. Vanessa simply nodded, her face unreadable behind a professional mask. Please, sit, Victoria said, settling into her chair with the kind of grace that comes from never having worried about money. I sat, placing my portfolio carefully on the table in front of me. The leather was cracked in places, the brass clasp tarnished despite my efforts to polish it. It had been my father's too. He'd carried it to pitch meetings when he ran his small design studio in Ohio, before the cancer, before everything fell apart, before the world became divided into before and after. Preston leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in a gesture I recognized from business school case studies, the posture of authority and judgment. So, Jordan, tell us about yourself. What brings you to New York, and why Apex? I launched into the speech I'd practiced dozens of times in my tiny studio apartment, watching myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in graphic design and marketing. For the past 4 years, I worked at Riverside Creative in Cleveland as a junior designer, working my way up to senior designer and eventually art director. I've led campaigns for diverse clients, focusing on strategic storytelling and measurable results. Riverside Creative? Victoria interrupted, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising. I'm not familiar with that agency. Are they part of a larger network? The question felt like a trap, though I couldn't quite articulate why. It's a smaller, regional firm, I explained. Independent. We worked primarily with local businesses, nonprofits, and some statewide accounts. Boutique work? Preston cut in, his tone making it clear what he thought of that. The word boutique in his mouth sounded like an insult. And you mentioned Ohio State. Not a traditional creative school. No portfolio program. I was in their design program, I said, feeling heat creep up my neck. I supplemented with independent studies, online courses, internships. Self-taught, essentially, he said, as if that settled something important. Vanessa shifted in her seat, and I caught what might have been discomfort flashing across her face, but she didn't speak. Victoria was making notes on her tablet, her expression neutral but somehow still conveying disappointment. And your suit? Preston said suddenly, not even trying to hide the smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. Is that vintage? The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. I felt my face flush, shame and anger mixing into something toxic in my chest. Around the table, there was a moment of suspended animation. Victoria's pen paused mid-stroke, Vanessa's eyes widened slightly, but Preston just sat there, waiting for an answer to his cruel question. It was my father's, I said quietly, my voice tight with barely controlled emotion. He passed away last year. The silence that followed was excruciating. Victoria's expression shifted to something that might have been pity but looked more like secondhand embarrassment. Preston had the decency to look uncomfortable for approximately half a second before his features settled back into professional neutrality. Oh. Victoria cleared her throat softly. I'm sorry for your loss, Jordan. That must have been difficult. The platitude hung in the air, meaningless and hollow. They weren't sorry. They didn't know my father, didn't know what it felt like to watch someone who'd been larger than life shrink down to 90 pounds, didn't understand the weight of inheriting a suit because it was all that was left. But you understand, Victoria continued, her voice taking on a carefully modulated tone, that Apex Creative represents the pinnacle of the industry. We have Fortune 500 clients, international campaigns. We're working with Google, Mercedes-Benz, American Express. Our team members are expected to embody excellence in every aspect, including presentation and professional image. There was the real interview. Not about my skills or my ideas or my potential. About whether I looked the part. I understand that, I replied, my jaw so tight I could feel my teeth grinding. That's exactly why I'm here. I want to work at that level. I want to create work that matters. Preston exchanged a glance with Victoria that I wasn't supposed to see but did. It said everything. This is a waste of our time. Why did we even bring him in? How quickly can we end this? Why don't you tell us about your experience with major brand campaigns? Vanessa spoke for the first time since introductions, her voice neutral but not unkind. Large-scale work, significant budgets, national or international reach. At Riverside, I worked on several campaigns for regional tire shops and local restaurant chains. Preston read from my resume, which lay open in front of him like evidence in a trial. Miller's Tire Emporium, Buddy's Barbecue Shack, Lakewood Dental Associates. He looked up, and this time the condescension was fully on display, not even hidden behind professional courtesy. Nothing national. Nothing with real stakes. Nothing that required you to present to executives who've built billion-dollar companies. He leaned forward, and I could smell his expensive cologne. Jordan, I'm going to be direct with you because I respect your time. Do you really think experience making flyers for mom-and-pop shops prepares you to handle a client like Mercedes-Benz or American Express? Do you understand the pressure, the complexity, the sophistication required at this level? Something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like ice on a frozen lake, spiderwebbing out from a single point of pressure. I'd been poor, I'd been desperate, I'd been humble. I'd swallowed my pride and accepted less than I deserved. But I wasn't going to sit here and be humiliated by someone who'd probably never had to choose between buying groceries and paying for gas. I brought my portfolio, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. If you'd like to actually see my work before making assumptions about my capabilities. Victoria let out a small laugh, quickly covered by clearing her throat. Of course, though I'm not sure a portfolio from regional work will really demonstrate. Let's take a look, Vanessa interrupted, genuine curiosity cutting through the tension. That's why we're here, isn't it? To see the work. I met her eyes and saw something there. Maybe skepticism, maybe fairness, but at least it was engagement rather than dismissal. I reached for the portfolio, my hands steadier than I expected. The brass clasp clicked open, and the cracked leather fell away to reveal what I'd been carrying all along. What I'd been protecting. What I knew would change everything. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned to the first page of my portfolio. Not from nervousness anymore, from something else entirely. Something that had been building inside me through every condescending glance, every dismissive comment, every assumption that my worth could be measured by the age of my suit rather than the quality of my work. The first piece was a full-page print ad, mounted on thick presentation board. The composition was striking, bold typography that seemed to leap off the page, a color palette that was both sophisticated and emotionally resonant, photography that captured something ineffable about human aspiration. In the bottom right corner, small but unmistakable, was a metallic sticker, Cannes Lions Bronze Award, 2022. Preston's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, his expensive watch catching the light as he reached out to touch the page, as if to verify it was real. This is from the Cannes Lions Festival, Vanessa said, her sharp eyes moving from the page to my face, reassessing everything. 2022, bronze in print advertising. That's correct, I said, turning the page to reveal the full campaign, 6 complementary pieces that work together to tell a cohesive story. I created this campaign for a sustainable footwear startup called Groundwork. We were working with a $12,000 budget total, about what most agencies here probably spend on a single photo shoot or a week of Instagram ads. I let that sink in for a moment, watching their expressions shift. The campaign went viral organically. We hit 4.7 million impressions in the first month without any paid media spend. Generated 4.3 million in sales in the first quarter, which for a startup in their second year of operation, represented 340% growth over the previous quarter. The next page showed a detailed breakdown of the strategy, target audience psychographics, competitive analysis, media planning, and most importantly, the results. Engagement metrics were printed in clean infographics, 847% increase in follower count, 2.1 million organic reach, 34,000 website visits directly attributed to the campaign. Victoria had stopped smiling. She was studying the portfolio with the laser focus of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew, her previous dismissiveness evaporating like morning fog. Groundwork, Preston said slowly, recognition dawning in his voice. I remember this campaign. It was everywhere on Ad Age and Communication Arts. The industry was talking about it for months. But the agency credited was. He trailed off, realization settling over his features like a cold shadow. Riverside Creative, I finished for him, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice. A small, regional firm in Cleveland that nobody at Apex Creative Studios has heard of. We didn't have the budget for awards submissions or trade magazine advertising. We were too busy actually doing the work. I turned another page, revealing a comprehensive rebrand for a healthcare system. The before and after comparison was dramatic. The old brand identity looked dated and sterile. The new one felt modern, approachable, trustworthy. Logo design, color systems, typography standards, wayfinding signage, digital interface designs, patient communication materials, even the redesign of hospital gowns to be more dignified. Mercy Regional Medical Center, I explained, my voice gaining confidence with each word. They were hemorrhaging patients to larger hospitals in Columbus. Community trust was at an all-time low after a malpractice scandal 2 years prior. They were considering selling to a larger health system, essentially ceasing to exist as an independent institution. I pulled out a supplementary sheet showing the detailed case study. We repositioned them around radical transparency and community-centered care. We didn't just change their logo, we changed how they communicated with patients, how they trained staff, how they showed up in the community. Patient intake increased 34% in 6 months. Their patient satisfaction scores went from 2.1 stars to 4.6 stars. They went from considering bankruptcy to expansion. They've since opened 2 new clinics in underserved areas. Vanessa reached out and gently turned the page herself, revealing a campaign that even I was particularly proud of. It was for a youth literacy program. Posters that felt raw and real, social media content that had the authenticity of genuine documentary work, and stills from a video series that captured something essential about the struggle and triumph of learning to read. The imagery was powerful. Kids of different backgrounds, holding books, their expressions ranging from frustration to joy to determination. The tagline was simple: every story starts with a single word. "This won you the Can Bronze," Vanessa said. It wasn't a question. She was stating a fact, connecting the dots. Yes. The documentary series was shot on an iPhone 12 with a $3,000 total production budget. We couldn't afford a production company or professional crew. So I learned how to shoot and edit myself. We cast real kids from the program, real teachers, real volunteers. No actors, no scripts beyond loose outlines. Just real stories about the transformative power of literacy. I pulled up the video on my laptop, letting it play on the screen. 30 seconds of a 10-year-old girl named Aisha struggling with a paragraph, her tutor patiently working with her, and then the moment, captured with perfect timing, when something clicked, when she read a full sentence smoothly, when her face lit up with the realization that she could do this. The room was silent except for the audio from the video. Even Preston seemed moved, though he was clearly fighting it. The campaign raised $890,000 in donations, I continued. Enough to completely fund the program for 3 years and expand to 2 additional schools. But more importantly, volunteer tutor applications increased by 600%. The program had a waiting list of kids for the first time ever because suddenly, in a city that had largely forgotten about them, people cared. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't awkward or dismissive. It was contemplative, reassessing. I turned to another section, revealing spec work I'd done for major brands, campaigns that existed only in my imagination and this portfolio, but that demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond anything Riverside had actually paid me to create. This is spec work, I admitted. Personal projects done on my own time. I wanted to prove to myself that I could think at the level of major brands, that I understood not just design execution but strategic positioning. The first piece was a complete rebranding concept for a major athletic wear company that was struggling to compete with Nike and Adidas. The work was sophisticated brand architecture, audience segmentation, campaign concepts, media strategy, even mock-ups of retail experiences. Preston leaned in, his professional curiosity finally overriding his previous dismissiveness. "This targeting strategy," he said, pointing to the audience segmentation analysis I'd included. "This is exactly the approach we pitched to Rivian last month." "How did you?" "Because it's the right strategy," I interrupted, not aggressively but firmly. "It's what the market research indicates. It's what the cultural moment demands. It's what makes sense if you actually study the data instead of relying on conventional wisdom." I turned the page to show another spec campaign, this one for a hypothetical electric vehicle launch. The creative was bold, the messaging sophisticated, the media strategy integrated across channels in ways that showed I understood modern consumer journeys. "You saw it because you're good at what you do," I continued, meeting Preston's eyes directly. "I saw it because I'm good at what I do. The difference is that you've had access to resources, teams, clients, and budgets that let you execute these ideas. I've had to prove these concepts in a vacuum, to myself, because nobody was giving me the opportunity to prove them in the real world." Victoria was scrolling through the pages now, her perfectly manicured nail tracing over strategy documents and creative executions. "Jordan, I have to ask, and please understand I'm not trying to be insensitive, But if you've done work at this level, if you've won international awards, why are you still in Cleveland? Why aren't you at a major agency already? Why aren't recruiters fighting over you? And there it was. The question I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. The question that required me to expose the raw wound that was my last few years. I took a breath, steadying myself. My father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer 3 years ago. He'd run his own small design studio, Peterson Design, maybe 15 employees at its peak, and that's actually where I got my start. I grew up in that studio, learned design by watching him work, started taking on small projects when I was in high school. The words came easier than I expected, maybe because I'd said them to myself so many times, trying to make peace with the choice I'd made. When he got sick, I had to choose. I was 25, getting offers from agencies in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. Good offers. The kind of opportunities that could launch a career. But my father was dying and he'd lost most of his staff because the studio couldn't sustain itself while he was sick. My mother died when I was 12, so it was just us. I saw Victoria's expression soften, saw even Preston shift uncomfortably in his chair. So I stayed. I took the job at Riverside Creative because they were the only agency in Cleveland that would let me have the flexibility I needed. Doctor appointments, hospital stays, hospice care at the end. The pay was terrible, but Gary, the owner, he at least understood that I needed irregular hours. I paused, organizing the memories that still felt too raw, too close. My father lasted 18 months. Longer than the doctors predicted. He was stubborn. I smiled despite myself. Right up until the end, he was giving me feedback on my work, telling me about composition and color theory from his hospital bed. When he died, I had to settle his debts. The studio had gone under during his illness. Clients left, contracts canceled. Medical bills, even with insurance, were catastrophic. I'm still paying them off. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the ambient noise from the office outside seemed to have faded away. I sold everything I could, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion underneath. My car. Most of my furniture. My father's house, the house I grew up in. I kept 3 things: my laptop because I couldn't work without it, his portfolio because it held his legacy, and his suit because I couldn't let go of everything. I gestured to the navy fabric I was wearing, which suddenly felt less like a source of shame and more like armor. And I kept working. I kept creating. Because that's what he taught me to do. Make great work regardless of circumstances. The budget doesn't matter. The tools don't matter. The suit doesn't matter. The work matters. Always the work. Preston cleared his throat, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. Jordan, I apologize. I made assumptions. You made judgments, I corrected him, not harshly but truthfully. Based on superficial markers of class and access rather than actual capability. Which is fine. It's what most people do. But it's also why you almost missed this portfolio. Why you almost dismissed work that's objectively award-winning, strategically sound, and creatively exceptional. I turned to another section of the portfolio, showing more recent work. This is from the past 6 months. After my father died, after the debts were settled, I started building toward this moment. Toward getting out of Cleveland, toward working at the level I know I'm capable of. The pages showed an evolution of thinking, campaigns that were increasingly sophisticated, strategy documents that demonstrated depth of cultural understanding, executions that proved I could work across media and platforms. There was a complete brand positioning for a hypothetical fintech startup targeting Gen Z users. A social impact campaign for climate action that balanced emotional appeal with data-driven calls to action. A luxury goods campaign that understood aspiration without condescension. You did all of this on spec? Victoria asked, incredulous. While working full-time at Riverside and dealing with personal tragedy? What else was I supposed to do? I replied simply, stop creating? Stop growing? Stop believing that I deserved better than what I had. Vanessa closed the portfolio carefully, treating it with a reverence it hadn't received when I first placed it on the table. Her fingers traced the cracked leather as if seeing it differently now. not as a symbol of poverty but as evidence of persistence. "Jordan," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I'm going to be direct with you. We posted this creative director position 3 months ago. We've interviewed 47 candidates. Some from Whedon plus Kennedy. Some from Droga 5, BBDO, Ogilvy. People with impressive pedigrees, strong portfolios, all the right credentials and connections." She paused, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that felt like she was seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time. "And not one of them has shown me work this good." The conference room felt different now, smaller somehow, despite its floor-to-ceiling windows and expansive glass walls that revealed the busy office beyond. Or maybe it was that I felt bigger. Not from arrogance, but from something I'd forgotten I possessed, the unshakable knowledge of my own worth. Preston pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "I'm sending photos of these pieces to Catherine. She's going to want to see this." "Preston, we're in the middle of an interview," Victoria protested, though her tone lacked conviction. She was still looking at my portfolio, occasionally turning back to previous pages as if to confirm what she'd seen. "An interview that should have been conducted very differently from the start," he replied, not looking up from his phone. When he did finally meet my eyes, there was something new in his expression. Respect, yes, but also what looked like genuine embarrassment. "Jordan, I apologize. I made assumptions based on superficial factors that have nothing to do with creative capability or professional potential. That was unprofessional and, frankly, beneath the standards we claim to uphold here at Apex." The apology caught me off guard. I'd prepared myself for rejection, even for grudging acknowledgement, but not for genuine contrition from someone who'd been so dismissive just minutes before. "We see hundreds of candidates every year," Victoria added, and I noticed her perfectly composed demeanor finally showing cracks. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Most of them look the part, the right schools, the right agencies on their resumes, the right clothes, the right vocabulary. But when you dig into their portfolios, it's often derivative work, safe choices, nothing that really pushes boundaries or demonstrates original thinking." She looked at me directly, and I saw something like regret in her eyes. "You walked in here and I judged you immediately. I'm trained to assess cultural fit, to identify who will thrive in our environment. But what I actually did was filter for markers of privilege and mistake them for markers of talent." She laughed, but it was hollow, self-deprecating. "That's actually terrifying from a recruiting perspective. How many brilliant people have we passed over because they didn't fit an aesthetic we'd unconsciously defined as success?" Vanessa had been quiet, still studying one particular page in my portfolio, the youth literacy campaign. She traced her finger over the image of Aisha, the 10-year-old girl learning to read. "Tell me about this one," she said. "Walk me through the entire process. What made you choose to shoot on an iPhone when you could have argued for a larger production budget? How did you gain access to these kids, their stories? And how did you know this approach would resonate?" I appreciated that she was still engaging with the work itself, not just reacting to the revelation. This was a real conversation now, the kind of creative discussion I'd been hungry for. "Two primary reasons for the iPhone," I explained, settling into the topic. "First, authenticity. These were kids from underfunded schools in low-income neighborhoods, families struggling with food insecurity, housing instability, all the systemic challenges that make literacy development harder. Rolling in with professional cameras, lighting crews, boom mics, it would have created an immediate barrier. It would have turned their stories into a performance rather than truth." I pulled out my phone and opened a folder of behind-the-scenes photos. The iPhone made it intimate. I could sit with them, be at eye level, capture moments without this massive apparatus of production creating distance. The kids forgot the camera was there after about 5 minutes. That's when the real moments happened. Vanessa nodded, clearly understanding the creative decision from a place of experience. "The second reason," I continued, "was philosophical. I wanted to prove that limitations don't determine quality. That a kid with a smartphone and a good idea can create something just as impactful as an agency with $1 million production budget. It was part of the message of the campaign itself: literacy, creativity, opportunity, these things aren't about resources. They're about access, support, and determination. How did you approach the families? Victoria asked, genuinely curious now. That kind of access requires trust, especially in communities that have been exploited by media before. I spent 3 months volunteering at the literacy program before I ever proposed the campaign, I said. Showed up every Tuesday and Thursday evening, helped with tutoring, got to know the kids and their families. I wasn't there as a designer or a filmmaker. I was there as someone who believed in what they were doing. I remembered those evenings, sitting in a church basement with fluorescent lighting and donated books, watching kids struggle with words, celebrating tiny victories. It had been some of the most meaningful work I'd ever done, even though I wasn't getting paid. When I finally proposed documenting their stories, it wasn't coming from a stranger with a camera. It was coming from Jordan, who helped Marcus with his phonics every week, who brought snacks and made terrible jokes, who'd earned the right to ask. Vanessa smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. You don't just make ads. You understand systems, cultural systems, economic systems, the systems that determine who gets to participate in creativity and whose stories get told. That's rare, even at agencies that claim to value purpose-driven work. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. A woman in her early 60s walked in, and the energy in the room immediately shifted. Everyone sat up straighter, their attention sharpening. She radiated the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp, modern bob. She wore a black pantsuit that was simultaneously simple and clearly expensive, with a silver necklace that looked like it might be a piece of contemporary art. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. Everyone stood immediately. I followed their lead, my heart suddenly pounding. Ms. Ashford, Preston said, his tone respectful in a way it hadn't been during our entire interview. Thank you for coming down. This is Jordan Mitchell. Catherine Ashford, CEO and founder of Apex Creative Studios. I'd seen her face in Adweek profiles, heard her speak in a TED Talk about the future of advertising and ethical creativity. She'd built Apex from a 3-person startup in her apartment to a 400-employee powerhouse over 30 years, all while maintaining a reputation for creative excellence and refusing to compromise on values even when it would have been more profitable. She extended her hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong. Jordan, Preston sent me photos of your portfolio. I had to see it in person. Her eyes moved to the worn leather case on the table, then back to my face. May I? Of course, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She sat down at the head of the table, and everyone else followed suit. The portfolio looked different in her hands, not shabby, but earned. She began examining each page with meticulous attention, the kind of focus that suggested she was actually seeing the work, not just glancing at surface aesthetics. Minutes passed. The room remained silent except for the soft sound of pages turning and the ambient noise from the office beyond our glass walls. Ms. Ashford didn't skip a single page, didn't skim. She absorbed every campaign, every strategy note, every award sticker, every metric. She paused longest on the youth literacy campaign, reading the case study in detail. Then she looked up at me. You shot this on an iPhone. Yes, ma'am. Why? I started to explain the same reasoning I'd just shared, but she held up a hand. I read your notes here. Authenticity, accessibility, message alignment. She studied my face. But there's another reason, isn't there? You couldn't afford professional production. The directness of the question was startling. No, I couldn't. And yet you didn't let that limitation stop you. You transformed it into a creative strength. She returned to the portfolio, continuing her methodical review. When she reached the spec-work section, she slowed down even more. Her finger traced over the electric vehicle campaign strategy, the fintech positioning, the luxury goods concepts. She pulled out her phone and took several photos of specific pages. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she closed the portfolio and looked directly at me. How much is Riverside paying you? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it took me a moment to answer. $48,000 a year. Victoria actually gasped, A small sound of shock quickly suppressed. Preston's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly and shook her head. That's criminal, Ms. Ashford said flatly, with the kind of moral certainty that comes from someone who's built their entire career on fair practices. Work at this level in New York would command 6 figures easily. Likely north of 150. Possibly closer to 200 depending on the role. She paused, letting that information settle like dust after an explosion. They knew what they had, didn't they? Your employers at Riverside. They understood your talent level. I thought about Gary, the owner of Riverside Creative. The way he'd react when I showed him the Cannes Lion Award, offering a modest smile and a $1,200 bonus, not even enough to cover the cost of the award submission. The way he'd pile more work on my desk while hiring his nephew at $65,000 to do social media management. The way he'd sigh and say, budget constraints, whenever I asked about raises, while posting Instagram photos from his vacation home in Turks and Caicos. Yes, I said. They knew. And they underpaid you anyway, banking on your personal circumstances keeping you trapped. It wasn't a question. I nodded, feeling something release in my chest. Having someone name it, acknowledge it, validate what I'd suspected but tried to rationalize away. Ms. Ashford stood, walking to the window that overlooked Midtown Manhattan. The city stretched out below us, endless possibility rendered in glass and steel. She was quiet for a long moment, and no one else dared speak. This industry has a systemic problem, she finally said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd been fighting an uphill battle for decades. We talk endlessly about merit and talent, about finding the best creative minds regardless of background. We put out statements about diversity and inclusion. We sponsor scholarships and mentorship programs. She turned back to face the room, her expression serious. But we filter candidates through markers of class and privilege that have nothing to do with creative ability. Where they went to school, as if only people who could afford $70,000 a year in tuition can think strategically. What agencies they've worked for, as if only people who already had connections could get hired at prestigious firms. How they dress, how they speak, what neighborhood they live in, whether they know the right wine to order at a client dinner. Her eyes swept across everyone in the room, landing last on me. We miss brilliant people because they don't fit our narrow aesthetic of what success should look like. And then we wonder why all our campaigns feel the same, why we keep hiring from the same tiny pool of people who've had every advantage from birth, why we struggle to connect with audiences whose lives look nothing like ours. The words hung in the air, an indictment not just of this interview but of an entire system. I felt seen in a way I hadn't experienced since my father died, seen not as a charity case or an exception, but as evidence of a larger truth. Jordan, Ms. Ashford continued, returning to her seat at the table, I'm not going to offer you the creative director position we posted. My heart sank, even though some part of me had been expecting it. Of course. This had all been too good to... I'm offering you senior creative director. Reporting directly to Vanessa. Starting salary of $165,000, with performance bonuses that could take you to $210,000. Full benefits, comprehensive health insurance, mental health support, for weeks vacation, and $25,000 in relocation assistance to help you move to New York. The numbers didn't even sound real. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. I struggled to find words. That's incredibly generous. But the position you advertised was for creative director, not senior. It's not generous, Ms. Ashford interrupted firmly. It's what you're worth. Probably still less than what I'd pay someone with your talent who came from Wheaton plus Kennedy or Droga 5, which is its own conversation we need to have about bias and valuation. But it's a start. We have a lot of work to do, Vanessa added, standing and gathering her materials. HR will reach out this afternoon with the formal offer and onboarding information. Can you start in 3 weeks? I know that's fast, but we have a major pitch coming up in 6 weeks, and I'd love to have you involved. I can start in 2, I said. I just need to give notice and pack up my apartment. I don't have much. Vanessa smiled. 2 weeks it is. I'll send you some reading, case studies, Client briefs, our creative philosophy document. Get familiar with how we work. Though honestly, based on what I've seen today, you're going to fit in just fine. As I left the conference room, portfolio clutched against my chest, I felt like I was walking through a dream. The office that had felt intimidating an hour ago now felt like a place I might actually belong. In the elevator down, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. My father's suit looked different now, not shabby, but dignified. Not a marker of poverty, but evidence of love, legacy, and the strength to carry forward even when everything fell apart. I pulled out my phone as I exited onto 42nd Street, the city suddenly looking different, full of possibility instead of barriers. I had 3 texts waiting. One from my landlord in Cleveland about next month's rent. One from a college friend asking how the interview went. And one from my Aunt Linda, my father's sister, just checking in. I called Linda first. She answered on the second ring. "Jordan, how did it go?" "I got it," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Not just got it, they offered me Senior Creative Director. $165,000 a year, Aunt Linda. They loved my work." She was crying before I finished the sentence. "Oh honey, your father would be so proud. He always knew you had this in you." We talked for a few minutes, logistics about moving, promises to visit, her insistence on helping with whatever I needed. When we hung up, I stood on the corner of 42nd and 5th, letting the city rush around me, feeling for the first time in years like I could breathe fully. I had made it. Not despite my circumstances, but carrying them with me, transformed into strength instead of shame. The rain had stopped, and Manhattan gleamed in the afternoon light, full of stories waiting to be told. 3 weeks later, I stood in a different room, wearing a different suit. This one was new, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored by a men's shop in Chelsea that Vanessa had recommended. It fit properly, felt expensive against my skin, moved with me instead of against me. The tailor had asked if I wanted to discard the old suit I'd brought in for reference, and I'd surprised myself by saying no. My father's old navy suit now hung in my new apartment's closet, professionally cleaned and preserved in an archival garment bag. I'd never wear it to another interview, but I'd never get rid of it either. Some things are about more than fabric. They're about memory, about the weight of what we carry forward, about the people who shaped us even after they're gone. My new apartment in Astoria was small but light-filled, with hardwood floors and a view of nothing in particular, just other buildings, a slice of sky, the ordinary beauty of city life. After years in Cleveland's cheapest neighborhoods, having a place where I felt safe, where the heat worked consistently, where I didn't hear my neighbors' arguments through paper-thin walls, felt like luxury beyond measure. The $25,000 relocation assistance had covered first and last month's rent, the security deposit, basic furniture, and the professional wardrobe I'd needed to build. I'd bought carefully, good pieces that would last, versatile enough to mix and match, appropriate for client meetings and creative sessions alike. Nothing excessive, but nothing that would make me stand out for the wrong reasons again. My new office at Apex had a view of the Chrysler Building, its Art Deco spire catching the morning light like something from a postcard. Every morning for the first week, I'd arrived early just to sit at my desk and absorb the reality that this was my life now. My name was on the door. My title, Senior Creative Director, was on my business card. My salary was deposited into my bank account, transforming numbers that had always induced anxiety into numbers that meant possibility. But what struck me most wasn't the space or the salary or even the title. It was the work, and the fact that people actually listened when I spoke. In my second week, Vanessa had thrown me into the deep end, a major pitch for a global athletic brand looking to reposition themselves around sustainability and social responsibility. The kind of account that agencies fought over for years, that could define careers and build reputations. She'd given me 3 weeks and a team of 6 talented designers and strategists, most of whom had been in the industry longer than I had. The first team meeting had been tense. I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Who was this outsider, promoted so quickly, given such a crucial pitch? But I'd learned long ago that you earn respect through work, not words. Conference room 3 in 5 minutes. Vanessa's voice came through my office phone, pulling me from my thoughts. The client's here early. They brought their entire executive team. I grabbed my laptop and the pitch deck we'd been refining down to the last pixel, the last word, the last strategic nuance. My team was already gathering in the hallway: Liam, our lead designer, Sophie, our strategist, Marcus, who handled motion graphics, and 3 junior creatives who'd contributed research and execution. Everyone ready? I asked. Liam nodded, though I could see nerves in his expression. This was his first pitch at this level too. Deck is loaded, backup files are ready, and I've got the physical boards in case technology fails us. But remember, we're not just presenting a campaign. We're presenting a new way of thinking about their brand. Stay confident, stay flexible, and if they challenge us, engage with it. Pushback means they're interested. In the hallway, I passed Preston, who'd become an unexpected mentor over the past few weeks. He'd taken me to client dinners, introduced me to key players in the industry, advocated for my ideas in strategy meetings where I didn't yet have the political capital to advocate for myself. Good luck in there, he said, genuine warmth in his voice. Not that you'll need it. I saw the deck yesterday. It's exceptional work. The conference room was already packed when we arrived. The client, Summit Athletic, a company trying to compete with Nike and Adidas in an increasingly crowded market, had brought 12 people. Their CEO, Miranda Oakes, was a woman in her mid-40s with the focused intensity of someone who'd built a company from running shoes to a billion-dollar valuation. Next to her sat their CMO, creative director, head of sustainability, head of digital, and various VPs and directors whose exact roles I'd memorized from LinkedIn stalking. This was it. This was what 6 weeks at Apex had been building toward. Vanessa made introductions, her voice confident and warm. Thank you all for being here. This is Jordan Mitchell, our senior creative director, who's been leading the strategic and creative development for this pitch. Jordan, the floor is yours. I connected my laptop to the display screen, and my opening slide filled the wall, a powerful image of a child's footprint in rich soil, with overlaid text in clean typography. Every step forward should give back. Thank you all for being here, I began, making eye contact with Miranda and then scanning the rest of the room. Over the past 3 weeks, my team and I have been thinking deeply about what sustainability means in the athletic industry, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a cultural, social, and economic one. I advanced to the next slide, showing research data we'd compiled from market studies, consumer surveys, and cultural trend analysis. Your competitors are all talking about recycled materials and carbon-neutral shipping, which is important, necessary work. But here's what we found. 73% of consumers say they can't tell the difference between one brand's sustainability message and another's. The market is saturated with green messaging that all sounds exactly the same. I let that sink in, watching Miranda lean forward with interest. What's missing, I continued, is radical transparency and human connection. The story of where materials actually come from, who makes them, what their lives look like, and what happens to products after their life cycle ends. You're not just making shoes, you're participating in a global ecosystem of labor, resources, communities, and environmental impact. The next series of slides showed our campaign concept, a multi-platform documentary-style series following the entire supply chain. Rubber tappers in Southeast Asia showing their daily work. Factory workers in Vietnam talking about their conditions, their families, their hopes. The logistics of shipping and distribution. The customers who'd eventually wear the shoes, and what happened when they were done with them. Real people. Real stories. Radical transparency. We're proposing something most brands are terrified of, I said, pacing slightly as I spoke, my confidence growing with each word. Complete visibility. Show the challenges, not just the successes. Let customers see that sustainability isn't about perfection, it's about progress, accountability, and constant improvement. Marcus had created sample videos that we played, beautifully shot footage that felt authentic rather than slick, paired with thoughtful narration that explained complex supply chain issues without condescension. The key insight, Sophie added, standing to walk through the strategy component, is that consumers don't want perfection anymore. They want honesty. They want to support brands that acknowledge problems and work to solve them, rather than brands that claim to have already solved everything. We walked them through the full execution plan: social media content, long-form documentary series on YouTube, interactive website features where customers could trace their specific shoe's journey, retail installations that brought the stories to life, and a partnership program where customers could return old shoes for recycling and see exactly what happened to them. The budget breakdown was thorough but not excessive. The media strategy was integrated across platforms. The measurement framework showed how we tracked not just engagement metrics but actual impact. Tons of waste diverted, workers' lives improved, transparency standards met. When I finished, the room was silent, but it was the good kind of silence, the electric kind that happens when an idea resonates at a frequency people weren't expecting. Miranda sat back in her chair, exchanging glances with her CMO and creative director. "How long have you been at Apex, Jordan?" "6 weeks, I admitted. She laughed, but it was warm, impressed. 6 weeks, and Vanessa already has you leading pitches for accounts like ours. That tells me something about both your capabilities and her confidence in you." "Jordan's work speaks for itself," Vanessa interjected smoothly. "We don't believe in wasting talent or time. When we see exceptional strategic thinking and creative execution, we put it to work." Miranda looked at her team, conducting some silent consultation through facial expressions and subtle nods. "We'll need to discuss this with our board and finance team, but I'm going to be honest, this is exactly the kind of thinking we were hoping to find. It's bold, it's risky in the right ways, and it feels authentic to who we're trying to become as a brand." She turned back to me. "When could you start production?" "Assuming we move forward, which I'm strongly inclined to do. We could have a preliminary production team scouted and ready in 3 weeks, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Full production could begin in 6 weeks, with the first content pieces ready for testing in 12 weeks. The CMO leaned forward. "And you'd be hands-on throughout? This feels like it needs creative leadership that really understands the vision." "Absolutely. I'd be overseeing creative direction, working with our production partners, and ensuring that every piece of content maintains the authenticity and strategic focus we've outlined today." The meeting continued for another hour, detailed questions about budget allocations, timeline flexibility, measurement frameworks, risk mitigation. My team handled every question with competence and clarity, and I felt a surge of pride in what we'd built together in such a short time. As the Summit Athletic team finally filed out, promising to connect within 48 hours with their decision, Miranda paused at the door. "Jordan, regardless of how this specific pitch goes, I want you to know, that was some of the smartest strategic thinking I've seen in 15 years of working with creative agencies. You have a real gift for connecting cultural insight with commercial viability." "Thank you," I said, meaning it deeply. "That means a lot." When the conference room finally cleared, Vanessa caught my arm, her expression bright with satisfaction. "That was exceptional work. You didn't just pitch them a campaign, you changed how they think about their own brand purpose and their role in the industry. That's the kind of thinking that wins long-term client relationships." "We'll see if they actually say yes," I replied, trying to manage my own expectations. "They'll say yes," Vanessa said confidently. "I've been doing this long enough to read a room." That was a yes wrapped in corporate process and approval protocols. Back in my office, I allowed myself a moment to process. 6 weeks ago, I'd been sitting in this building wearing my father's old suit, being mocked for my appearance, being dismissed before I'd even opened my portfolio. Now I just led a pitch to a billion-dollar company, and they'd listened. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hey Jordan, it's Gary from Riverside. Heard through the industry grapevine you're at Apex now. Congrats on the move. If things don't work out in New York, there's always a place for you back here." I stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger at his audacity. Satisfaction that he was clearly struggling without me. Pity that he still didn't understand why I'd left or what he'd lost. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Gary had made his choices and I'd made mine. Another text came through, this one from my Aunt Linda. "Thinking of you today. Your dad would be bursting with pride." Love you, kiddo. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always came when I thought about him. That particular grief that doesn't fade so much as it becomes woven into the foundation of who you are. A knock on my office door pulled me from my thoughts. Vanessa stood there with Catherine Ashford and a man I didn't recognize, early 40s, stylish in an understated way, warm eyes behind designer glasses. Got a few minutes? Ms. Ashford asked. Of course. They came in, and Ms. Ashford closed the door. Jordan, this is Thomas Wright. He's our Director of Strategic Initiatives. Thomas extended his hand. Great to finally meet you. I've heard impressive things. Jordan, Ms. Ashford began, settling into one of my office chairs, I wanted to check in now that you've been here 6 weeks. How are you settling in? Is the apartment working out? Team dynamics good? Are you getting what you need to do your best work? Everything's great, I said honestly. Better than I could have imagined. The team for the summit pitch has been incredible to work with. The resources here, the caliber of thinking, the support system, it's everything I'd hoped for and more. But I'm glad to hear it. She paused, and I recognized the shift in her energy that meant something significant was coming. Because I have a proposition for you. We're opening a new division focused exclusively on purpose-driven campaigns, brands that want to lead on social impact, environmental sustainability, cultural change. Work that matters beyond just moving product or building market share. She leaned forward, her expression serious and excited in equal measure. I want you to head it up. Build your own team from scratch, set the creative vision, shape how Apex approaches this entire sector. You'd still collaborate with Vanessa and other directors on major integrated accounts, but this would be your domain, your division, your opportunity to build something from the ground up. I stared at her, processing. Ms. Ashford, I've been here 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, Thomas interjected, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking this division needs. Strategic sophistication combined with genuine passion for meaningful work. The ability to connect authentic storytelling with commercial viability. And most importantly, lived experience that helps you understand audiences and challenges that many in this industry have never had to face. Ms. Ashford nodded. Someone who understands that creativity isn't about resources, it's about resourcefulness and perspective. Someone who sees systems and opportunities that others miss because they've never had to look that carefully. Someone who wore his father's old suit to an interview and still walked in with unshakable confidence in his work. I thought about what she was offering. The responsibility, the opportunity, the risk. Building something new always meant the possibility of failure, but it also meant the possibility of creating something genuinely different. What would the team structure look like? I asked. That's up to you, Thomas said. We're thinking 4 to 6 people initially, designers, strategists, content creators. You'd have budget for hiring, for building out the capabilities you think are necessary. As the division grows and proves its value, we'd scale accordingly. And clients? I asked. Would we be pitching new business, or working with existing accounts? Both, Ms. Ashford answered. Some of our current clients are already asking about this kind of work. But we'd also be targeting new business specifically in this space. B Corp, sustainability-focused brands, social enterprises, companies trying to balance profit with purpose. She paused, making sure I understood what came next. This isn't a ceremonial role, Jordan. This is a real leadership position with real pressure and real expectations. You'll be building and defending budgets, managing client relationships at the highest levels, representing Apex in industry conversations about purpose and impact. It's significantly more responsibility than what you're handling now. I'll do it, I said, the words coming faster than my conscious decision-making process. On one condition. Ms. Ashford raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You're negotiating already. What's the condition? When we hire for this new division, we don't filter candidates by pedigree. No bias toward particular schools or previous agencies. We do blind portfolio reviews, judge the work and the thinking without knowing where it comes from or who created it. We look for talent in unconventional places, Give opportunities to people who've been overlooked. Ms. Ashford and Thomas exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Done, Ms. Ashford said, extending her hand across my desk. Though I have to say, for someone who spent years being underestimated, you certainly know how to advocate for yourself and others. I shook her hand. I learned from experience what happens when you don't. And I learned that the system doesn't change unless people actively work to change it. Start thinking about your ideal team composition, Thomas said. We'll work with HR to craft job descriptions that focus on capabilities rather than credentials. I'm excited to see what you build. After they left, I sat at my desk for a long time, watching the light change across the Chrysler Building's iconic spire, watching the city move beneath me, millions of people pursuing their own dreams, their own versions of success, their own attempts to matter. I thought about my father, about the small studio he'd poured his life into, about the belief he'd instilled in me that good work transcends circumstances. He'd never made it to the big leagues, never worked for an agency like Apex, never had the resources or connections or opportunities that could have elevated his career. But he'd taught me everything that mattered: integrity over expedience, quality over quantity, meaning over money. He'd shown me that creativity wasn't about having the best tools or the biggest budgets. It was about having something to say and the skill to say it well. That evening, I took the subway home, my new suit traded for jeans and a comfortable sweater, my expensive briefcase replaced by a simple backpack. The train was crowded with people heading home from their own jobs, nurses still in scrubs, teachers carrying bags of papers to grade, construction workers with dust on their boots, delivery drivers checking their phones for the next assignment. The infrastructure of a city that never stops moving. The people who make everything work, whose labor and talent often go unrecognized because they're not in glamorous industries or prestigious positions. I thought about the division I'd be building, about the opportunity to tell stories that mattered, to work with brands trying to do better, to create a team culture that valued substance over style, capability over credentials. Back in my Astoria apartment, I opened the closet and looked at my father's suit in its archival bag. The fabric was worn but strong, stitched together with care and carried forward with love. Just like the portfolio, just like the career I'd built in the margins and shadows, just like everything he'd taught me about perseverance and principle. Tomorrow I'd start building something new, a division, a team, a different way of working that proved excellence came in many forms, from many places, often from people who'd been told they didn't belong. But tonight, I let myself feel the full weight of how far I'd come. Not measured in salary or title or office views, though those things mattered. Not even measured in professional recognition or industry respect, though I wouldn't pretend those weren't validating. The real measure was simpler and more profound. I'd stayed true to the work when everything else fell apart. I'd kept creating when it would have been easier to give up. I'd carried my father's legacy forward not by wearing his suit, but by embodying his principles. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document: Purpose Division, Team Structure and Vision. I began typing, ideas flowing faster than my fingers could capture them. This was just the beginning. There was so much work to do, so many stories to tell, so many talented people still waiting for someone to see past their circumstances to their capabilities. Outside my window, the city lights spread out like stars, each one representing someone's ambition, someone's struggle, someone's quiet determination to matter. I'd been one of those lights once, barely visible from Cleveland, dismissed as insignificant by people who thought they knew what talent looked like. Now I had the chance to build something that might help other lights shine brighter. And I wasn't going to waste it. 6 months later, the conference room on the 25th floor had become my second home. We'd moved the Purpose Division up 2 floors from the main creative department, not as a separation, but as an expansion. What had started as my small office and a team of 6 had grown into a full floor with 18 people, 3 conference rooms, and a creative space that felt more like a collaborative studio than a corporate office. I'd insisted on certain things during the build-out: natural light everywhere, a kitchen area where people could actually cook meals instead of just reheating takeout, comfortable furniture that didn't scream corporate, and most importantly, walls covered in work, not awards or accolades, but the actual campaigns we were building, the problems we were solving, the stories we were telling. This morning's meeting was crucial. Summit Athletic had been our first major client win, and their campaign had exceeded every metric we'd projected. The documentary series had been viewed 23 million times across platforms. Consumer sentiment had shifted measurably, their brand perception scores had increased 47% in key demographics. Most importantly, they'd seen a 28% increase in sales while simultaneously improving labor conditions in their supply chain and reducing waste by 34%. But today wasn't about Summit. Today was about what came next. "Everyone here?" I asked, scanning the room. My team had evolved into something special. Liam, the designer who'd been skeptical of me initially, had become my right hand. His execution skills were extraordinary, and he'd developed an instinct for knowing when to push boundaries and when to honor constraints. Sophie, our strategist, had a mind like a steel trap for data and an unusual gift for translating complex research into human insight. Then there were the people I'd hired specifically for this division, using the blind portfolio review process I'd insisted on. Keisha, a 26-year-old designer from Detroit who'd been working at a small nonprofit making $35,000 a year. Her portfolio had shown work that was technically flawless and emotionally devastating: campaigns for domestic violence survivors, reentry programs for formerly incarcerated people, youth mental health initiatives. Work that mattered, created with almost no resources. Ramon, a strategist from El Paso who'd been overlooked by every major agency because he'd gone to a state school and spent 5 years working for a small firm focused on Hispanic markets. His understanding of cultural nuance and demographic shifts was sophisticated in ways that most agencies were still struggling to comprehend. Yuki, a motion designer from Seattle who'd taught herself advanced animation while working full-time at a grocery store, creating stunning work at night because she couldn't afford design school. Her reel had made everyone on the hiring committee speechless. And 3 junior creatives. Maya, Jordan, yes, another Jordan, which had led to some amusing confusion, and Christopher, all talented, all hungry, all from backgrounds that traditional agencies would have filtered out before ever looking at their work. "We're all here," Keisha confirmed, settling into her chair with her ever-present notebook. She still took handwritten notes, a habit from her nonprofit days when she couldn't always count on technology working. "Good." I pulled up the presentation on the main screen. "So, as you all know, we've been in conversations with Elevate Foundation about their national campaign around economic mobility and workforce development." Elevate Foundation was a massive nonprofit backed by several tech billionaires, focused on creating pathways out of poverty through education, job training, and systemic advocacy. Their annual budget was $400 million, and they wanted to completely reimagine how they communicated their mission and impact. "They've invited us to pitch against 3 other agencies," I continued, "including 2 that are significantly larger than our division, with much longer track records in the nonprofit space." "Who are we up against?" Ramon asked, already pulling up his laptop to start competitive research. Cause and Effect out of San Francisco, mission-driven creative from DC, and surprisingly, a pitch team from Ogilvy's Social Impact Group. A few low whistles around the table. These were serious competitors, agencies that had built their entire reputations on purpose-driven work, plus Ogilvy's institutional weight and resources. "Here's what we know about what they're looking for," Sophie said, standing to walk through her research. Elevate is frustrated with the traditional nonprofit communications playbook. They're tired of poverty porn, images of sad children that generate donations but don't change narratives. They're tired of savior complexes, stories that center wealthy donors rather than the communities being served. And they're tired of impact metrics that don't actually measure impact. She clicked through slides showing examples of what Elevate wanted to move away from: well-intentioned but ultimately dehumanizing campaigns that reduced complex, systemic issues to emotional manipulation. "They want something radically different," Sophie continued. "They want communications that shifts how Americans think about poverty, work, and opportunity. Not just a campaign, a cultural intervention." The room was quiet, everyone absorbing the scope and ambition of what was being asked. "That's a massive ask," Liam finally said. How do you shift cultural narratives through a campaign? That's the work of movements, not marketing. Exactly, I said. Which is why most agencies will pitch them a traditional campaign with some progressive messaging. But I don't think that's what they actually need. I stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. What if we pitched them something entirely different? Not a campaign, but a platform. Not a message, but a movement infrastructure. Not communications about economic mobility, but communications that actually facilitate economic mobility. I started sketching out the concept as I spoke, my team leaning forward with interest. Imagine a multimedia platform that does three things simultaneously. First, it tells stories of people navigating poverty and systemic barriers with the same production value and narrative sophistication we'd give to any premium content. Not inspirational poverty porn, but real, complex human stories that honor people's full humanity. I drew 3 interconnected circles on the board. Second, it provides actual resources, job training information, financial literacy tools, legal aid connections, mental health support, childcare assistance. Everything embedded directly into the content so that storytelling and service provision are integrated. Third, Keisha added, seeing where I was going, it creates community. A space where people experiencing these challenges can connect with each other, share strategies, build networks. Not as charity recipients, but as experts on their own lives. Exactly, I said, feeling the energy in the room shift as the concept took shape. We're not talking about a campaign that talks about economic mobility. We're talking about building infrastructure that enables economic mobility while simultaneously changing the narrative around it. Ramon was already typing furiously. The data on this is actually really strong. People in poverty don't lack information or motivation, they lack access and resources. And they especially lack representation in media that doesn't treat them as problems to be solved. But how do we pitch this? Christopher asked. This is way beyond what they asked for. They wanted a communications campaign, and we're essentially proposing a technology platform, a media company, and a social network all at once. We pitch it as what they actually need versus what they think they need, I said. We show them that traditional campaigns haven't worked because they're addressing symptoms rather than systems. We show them that they have the resources to do something genuinely transformative, and that we have the creative thinking and strategic sophistication to help them do it. The team spent the next 3 hours building out the concept. Maya and Yuki worked on visual identity and user experience mockups. Ramon and Sophie dove into research and strategic frameworks. Liam and I sketched out the pitch structure and narrative arc. By early afternoon, we had something that felt genuinely different, ambitious to the point of audacity, but grounded in solid research and strategic thinking. This is either going to win us the pitch or get us thrown out of the room, Liam said, looking at our work spread across the conference table. Good, I replied. Safe work is forgettable work. And this brief deserves better than forgettable. 2 weeks later, I stood in a different conference room in a different building, Elevate Foundation's headquarters in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. The space was deliberately unpretentious, exposed brick, reclaimed wood, art from local community centers on the walls. Everything about it signaled that this organization took its values seriously. The Elevate team was smaller than I'd expected, just 5 people, but clearly the decision makers. Dr. Camille Washington, the founder and CEO, was a force of nature in her early 50s, a former community organizer who'd built Elevate from a single program in Baltimore to a national organization. Next to her sat their CMO, head of programs, head of policy, and a board member who'd made billions in tech and was now focused on giving it away strategically. Thank you for being here, Dr. Washington began. We've seen 3 pitches already this week. I'll be honest, they were all competent, professional, and utterly uninspiring. They all showed us variations of the same approach we've been funding for years, with slightly better production values. She looked directly at me. So I'm hoping you'll surprise us. I've heard interesting things about your division at Apex. I've seen the Summit Athletic campaign, which impressed me not just creatively but strategically. Show me what you've got. I took a breath, feeling my team's presence behind me like a foundation I could build on. Dr. Washington, before we show you our pitch, I need to tell you that we're not going to present what you asked for in your brief. Her eyebrows rose. Around the room, I felt rather than saw the tension of everyone wondering if I'd just committed professional suicide. You asked for a national communications campaign, I continued. And we could give you that. We could give you a beautiful, sophisticated, strategically sound campaign that would win awards and generate awareness and probably move some metrics in the ways you care about. I pulled up our first slide, not creative work, but the simple statement. The question isn't how to talk about economic mobility. The question is how to enable it. But we think you deserve better than another campaign. We think the communities you serve deserve better. And we think you have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do something genuinely transformative. Over the next 90 minutes, we walked them through our concept. Not a campaign, but a platform. Not messaging, but infrastructure. Not communications about change, but communications that facilitated change. We showed them mock-ups of what it could look like. A multimedia platform that felt like the love child of Netflix, LinkedIn, and a mutual aid network. Premium documentary content that told complex stories about poverty, work, and opportunity without condescension. Integrated tools and resources embedded directly into the experience. Community features that enabled people to connect, share strategies, build networks of support. The strategic insight, Sophie explained, is that people experiencing poverty are experts on poverty. They don't need to be talked at or talked about. They need platforms that amplify their expertise, resources that support their agency, and narratives that honor their full humanity. We showed them the research, data on how traditional poverty communications had failed to shift public opinion or policy, evidence that direct service provision through digital platforms had measurable impact, case studies of community-driven initiatives that had succeeded where institutional programs had failed. The budget for this is significantly higher than what you outlined in the brief, Ramon admitted, walking through financial projections. But the potential impact is exponentially greater. You're not just running a campaign, you're building infrastructure that could serve millions of people while simultaneously shifting cultural narratives. Yuki showed them motion tests for how the platform could work. Beautiful, intuitive, designed with the understanding that people accessing it might be doing so on old phones with limited data plans. Accessibility isn't an afterthought, she explained. It's the foundation. This platform has to work perfectly on a 3-year-old Android with spotty Wi-Fi, or it's useless to the people who need it most. When we finished, the room was quiet. Dr. Washington was leaning back in her chair, her expression unreadable. The CMO was scrolling through the deck on his tablet, occasionally stopping to zoom in on specific slides. Finally, Dr. Washington spoke. This is the most ambitious pitch I've seen in 20 years of doing this work. My heart sank slightly. Ambitious wasn't always a compliment. Sometimes it was a polite way of saying unrealistic. It's also, she continued, exactly what we need to be doing. We've been playing it safe for too long, making incremental improvements to approaches that fundamentally don't work. You're proposing we actually bet on the communities we claim to serve, trust them as experts, and build something that treats them as collaborators rather than beneficiaries. She looked at her team, that silent communication of people who've worked together long enough to read each other's micro-expressions. I can't make this decision alone, she said. This is too big, requires too much institutional commitment. We'll need board approval, significant budget reallocation, technology infrastructure we don't currently have. She stood and we all followed. But I'm going to fight for it. This is the kind of transformative thinking I started Elevate to enable. Give me 2 weeks to work through our internal processes. If I can get board approval and budget sign-off, are you prepared to start immediately? Yes, I said without hesitation. We shook hands, and as the Elevate team filed out, Dr. Washington paused at the door. Jordan, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Where did you learn to think like this? This kind of systems-level strategic thinking, this ability to see beyond what's been asked to what's actually needed, that's rare. Especially in the advertising world. I thought about how to answer that. About my father's studio in Ohio, about working at Riverside Creative with almost no resources, about the youth literacy campaign shot on an iPhone, about wearing a worn suit to an interview and being judged before I'd opened my portfolio. I learned it by having to solve problems with insufficient resources. I finally said, when you don't have money or tools or institutional support, you have to think differently. You have to question assumptions, find inefficiencies, build solutions from scratch. It's not because I'm smarter than people who've had more resources, it's just that necessity forces a different kind of creativity. She nodded slowly. The best innovations usually come from people who've been forced to innovate. I'll be in touch soon. The 2 weeks waiting for Elevate's decision were surreal. The division continued working on other projects. We'd signed 2 more clients and had pitches scheduled for 3 others. But Elevate felt different. It felt like the kind of work that could define not just our division, but potentially shift how the entire industry thought about purpose-driven communications. I was in my office reviewing quarterly budgets when Vanessa knocked on my open door. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always." She came in and closed the door, which was unusual. Vanessa wasn't someone who dealt in drama or unnecessary secrecy, so the gesture immediately signaled something significant. "I just got off the phone with Catherine," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "She wanted me to talk to you about something before it becomes official." My mind raced through possibilities, none of them particularly reassuring. "The board met yesterday," Vanessa continued. "They've been reviewing the performance of different divisions, looking at strategic priorities for the next 3 years. Your division has been a topic of significant discussion." I waited, my stomach tight with anxiety I was trying not to show. "Jordan, in 6 months, your division has signed 8 clients, generated $4.2 million in revenue, and created work that's been featured in every major industry publication. More importantly, you've shifted how Apex thinks about purpose-driven work. Other divisions are starting to adopt some of your approaches, the blind portfolio reviews, the focus on systemic thinking, the integration of impact metrics with creative excellence." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Catherine wants to expand the division. Significantly. Double the team size, increase your budget, give you more autonomy to pursue the kind of transformative projects like the Elevate pitch. But that comes with a title change and more responsibility." "What kind of title change?" "Vice President, Purpose and Impact. You'd have a seat at the executive leadership table, report directly to Catherine, and have influence over how Apex approaches all purpose-driven work, not just within your division." I stared at her, processing. Vice President. Executive leadership. 6 months after walking into this building in my father's old suit, being mocked for my appearance, nearly dismissed before I'd even opened my portfolio. "Jordan." Vanessa prompted. "You okay?" "Yeah, I laughed, surprised by the emotion in my voice. 6 months ago, I was making $48,000 a year in Cleveland. Now you're offering me a VP position at one of the most prestigious agencies in the country. It's a lot to process." "You've earned it," Vanessa said simply. "Not because we're being generous, but because you've demonstrated leadership, strategic thinking, and the ability to build something genuinely valuable. The board doesn't make these decisions lightly." My phone buzzed on my desk. I glanced at it, an email from Dr. Washington at Elevate Foundation. Subject line, "Board Decision." "That might be relevant to this conversation," I said, opening the email with hands that weren't quite steady. I read it quickly, then read it again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. "Elevate just approved the pitch," I said, looking up at Vanessa. "Full budget, 3-year commitment. They want to start development in 4 weeks." Vanessa's smile widened into genuine joy. "Then I'd say the timing is perfect. You're going to need that expanded team and additional resources. This project is going to be massive." She stood, extending her hand. "Congratulations, Jordan. On both the promotion and the client win. You've built something special here, and I'm excited to see what you do with even more support behind you." After she left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, watching the city through my window. The Chrysler Building still caught the afternoon light in that perfect way, The streets below still hummed with the endless motion of millions of lives intersecting and diverging. I pulled up my phone and scrolled to a photo I kept in a private album, my father in his navy suit, standing in front of his studio sign, grinning with the confidence of someone who believed in his work even when the world didn't always recognize its value. "We did it, Dad," I said quietly to the empty room. "We actually did it." My phone rang. "Aunt Linda. Did you accept the VP position?" she asked without preamble. "How do you even know about that already?" "Catherine Ashford called me personally. Said she wanted family to know before the formal announcement and also wanted to make sure you had support during this transition. I like her." I smiled. Of course Catherine had thought to do that. "I'm accepting," I said. "It's terrifying and exciting and probably insane to take on this much responsibility this quickly, but you're ready," Linda interrupted. "You've been ready. You've been doing VP-level work for years, just without the title or the paycheck. Now you're finally getting both." We talked for a few more minutes, logistics about when I'd visit Ohio, her insistence on throwing some kind of celebration, her pride that came through in every word. After we hung up, I opened my email and drafted my acceptance of the VP position. The words came easily, professionally, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were bringing to the role. Before I sent it, I stood and walked to the small closet in my office. In the back, preserved in its archival bag, hung my father's navy suit. I'd brought it to the office a month ago, not to wear but to have nearby, a reminder of where I'd come from, what I'd overcome, who I'd been when I thought I had nothing left to prove myself with except the quality of my work. I touched the garment bag gently, feeling the outline of fabric that had carried so much meaning. "Thank you," I said, to the suit, to my father's memory, to everything that had brought me to this moment. "For teaching me that worth isn't about what you wear or where you come from. It's about what you create and why it matters." Then I returned to my desk and sent the email accepting the vice presidency. Outside my window, the city continued its endless dance of ambition and struggle, success and failure, people rising and falling and rising again. I was one of millions pursuing something better, trying to build something meaningful, hoping to leave the world slightly different than I'd found it. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had the resources, the platform, and the support to actually do it. The work was just beginning.